I was 17 years old the morning I learned that a family can dissolve as quietly as sugar in water, and no one will hear it happen. There was no shouting. There was no slammed door. There was a note on the kitchen counter, weighted down by the sugar bowl, in my mother's handwriting, for words long. You'll figure it out. I count things for a living now. I have for 11 years. And the first thing I ever learned to count, the summer I turned 17, was how much a family costs to walk away from. The answer, it turns out, is nothing. It costs nothing at all if you're willing to leave the bill with someone else. Welcome back to Wise Dad Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a paper trail that took me 12 years to fully read. I'm a forensic accountant. I trace money for a living, where it came from, where it went, and who's lying about the gap in between. People think the job is about numbers. It isn't. It's about behavior. Numbers don't lie, but people arrange them to look like they haven't, and my entire career has been built on noticing the arrangement. I didn't choose this work by accident. I chose it because somewhere around age 17, I stopped trusting anyone's version of events that wasn't backed by a document, and I never stopped again. Before all of that, there was a small house in a small town, and there was my husband, Daniel, whom I married at 24 in a backyard with folding chairs and a borrowed arch, because neither of us had family willing to pay for more than that, and neither of us minded. Daniel didn't ask me many questions about my childhood in the beginning. He learned, the way people who love you learn things, by watching what made my shoulders go still. He knew not to mention surprise visits. He knew I flinched, just slightly, at the phrase, "We just assumed you'd handle it." He never made me explain why. My family, when I still had one in the conventional sense, ran on a kind of arithmetic nobody ever said out loud. My older brother, Corey, was the one who mattered, the one whose grades were framed, whose girlfriends were vetted, whose failures were reframed as setbacks on the way to something bigger. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who remembered the pediatrician's number, who signed my own school forms by 10th grade because my mother said she trusted me, who learned to cook because someone had to and it wasn't going to be Corey. I was 13 the first time I filed a form for myself and told no one, because telling someone meant it became my job permanently, and some tired, too young part of me already understood that once you show confidence, no one ever offers to take a task back. That was the arithmetic. Corey was loved out loud. I was loved in the currency of being useful, and I didn't know the two were different until I was much older, sitting across from a man in a suit who used the word irrevocable like it was nothing. But that comes later. First, the note. It was late June, the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. My parents had been talking, quietly, for months, about my father's new position, a promotion that required relocating 2 states away, effective the first week of July. I'd heard pieces of it. I hadn't heard the part where the plan didn't include me. I came home from a shift at the grocery store where I bagged produce for minimum wage, and the house was different. Not ransacked, organized. The kind of empty that takes weeks of planning to look effortless. My mother's closet was bare down to the wire hangers. The good dishes were gone. The car my father used for work trips was gone. On the kitchen counter, held down by the ceramic sugar bowl my grandmother had given my mother at her own wedding, was a single sheet of notebook paper. It said, "Sweetheart, Dad's job starts Monday. We didn't want to disrupt your last year of school, so we're letting you stay and finish it out at Aunt Carol's. Rent for the house is paid through August. After that, you'll figure it out. We're proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad." 4 sentences. I read them enough times that summer that I can still recite them in my sleep, the way you can recite the wording of something that rearranged your entire nervous system on first contact. Aunt Carol, it turned out, had not agreed to this. She found out the same day I did, from a phone call my mother made after the note was already on the counter. I remember standing in her kitchen while she held the phone away from her ear, her mouth open, saying, "Diane, you can't just, she's 17. I remember that Aunt Carol let me stay for 6 weeks before her own situation, a small apartment, a job that barely covered her own rent, made it clear that this wasn't a solution, it was a stall. I finished my senior year in a rented room above a laundromat, working 30 hours a week at the grocery store. On a payment plan, I negotiated myself with the landlord because I was 17 and didn't know that 17-year-olds generally aren't allowed to sign leases. I graduated with a 3.6 GPA and no one from my family in the audience. I have the program from that ceremony still. It's in a box in my closet, 3 items deep from the bottom, and I know exactly where it is because forensic accountants are people who always know exactly where things are. I want to be clear about something, because precision matters to me, and it will matter to this story. I did not spend the next 12 years plotting. I built a life. I got a scholarship, then a degree, then a CPA license, then a specialization in forensic work because I liked the part of the job where the truth was buried under someone's careful story and my task was simply to find it. I married Daniel. I bought a small house with a garden I actually get to keep. My parents and I spoke perhaps 4 times a year, brief, cordial, edged calls where nothing from that June was ever mentioned, where my mother would ask how work was and I would tell her, and where the forward sentence sat between us like furniture neither of us acknowledged, but both of us walked carefully around. Corey, meanwhile, had what I'd learned to call a supported adulthood. College paid in full. A down payment on a condo at 26. A wedding my parents financed top to bottom, 3 years before mine, where I was a guest, not a bridesmaid, seated at table 11 with cousins I barely knew. I didn't resent it, exactly. Resentment requires expecting something different. I had stopped expecting a long time before that wedding. What I did instead was keep records. Not out of vengeance, out of habit. I have every text message my mother has sent me since 2014, backed up in 3 places, because that is simply what I do with information. It is not a plan. It is a profession, worn into a personality. Then, in March of this year, my father died of a heart attack at 61, and everything I thought I understood about the arithmetic turned out to be only half the equation. If you've ever watched a family suddenly rediscover how much they love someone the moment there's an estate to discuss, you already know the shape of what's coming. Stick with me, the paperwork is where this story actually begins. The funeral was in the town where my parents had settled, 2 states from where I grew up, the same town the note had sent them to 12 years earlier. I flew in. Corey picked me up from the airport, and in the 20-minute drive to the house, he mentioned, 3 separate times, how much it was going to cost to sort everything out: the house, Dad's accounts, the timeshare in Florida no one used. He said "we" a lot. He said the estate like a man test driving, a phrase he intended to use for years. My mother, at the reception after the service, held my hand a beat too long and said, "Your father always said you were the responsible one. That's going to matter now." I filed that sentence away the way I file everything, exact wording, time-stamped, context noted. Not because I understood yet what it meant. Because 20 years of habit had trained me to notice when someone was laying groundwork. The formal reading of the will happened 11 days later, in a modest office 2 towns over, because my father, ever practical, had used a local attorney rather than a large firm. The attorney's name was Mr. Halloran, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses low on his nose, and he had my mother, Corey's wife, and me seated around a small conference table with a box of tissues no one used. The will was straightforward for the first 10 minutes. The house to my mother, as expected. The Florida timeshare, mercifully, sold off before death, its proceeds folded into a joint account. Then Mr. Halloran turned a page, cleared his throat, and read a clause that made the room go very still. My father had established an irrevocable trust 4 years earlier, not the will itself, a separate instrument, funded quietly with a life insurance policy and a portion of his retirement accounts my mother had apparently not known the full size of. The trust named a single primary beneficiary. Me. Corey's wife made a small sound. My mother's hand, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slightly. I did not move. I have trained myself, professionally, not to react to the first read of a document, because the first read is never the whole document, and a face that reacts too early tips your hand before you understand what you're reacting to. Mr. Halloran continued. The trust specified an amount. I won't say the number here, only that it was substantial, more than the house was worth. Funded specifically, the document noted. In recognition of financial responsibility assumed by the beneficiary at age 17, without parental support, culminating in independent self-sufficiency. My father's own words, notarized, dated for years old. He had known. He had watched from 2 states away, all those cordial 4 times a year phone calls, and he had known exactly what that note on the counter had cost me, down to the $16 an hour I'd made bagging groceries. There was a second page behind the trust document. A letter, handwritten, folded in thirds, my father's small, cramped handwriting that I hadn't seen since he used to sign my report cards. Mr. Halloran said it was addressed to me specifically, to be read privately, and passed it across the table. I did not read it there. I put it in my bag, said thank you to Mr. Halloran, and drove back to my rental car in silence while Corey stood on the office steps behind me, already on the phone with someone, his voice pitched low but not low enough. I heard the words, has to be a mistake, and obviously she'll split it. I read the letter that night alone, in a hotel room 2 towns over, 3 times, the way I read every document that matters. It was not long. It said, in part, that my father had never forgiven himself for the note, that my mother had insisted I would figure it out because I always had, and that he had let her insist because it was easier than the alternative, and that the trust was the only apology he knew how to make that couldn't be undone or unsaid 12 years later at a dinner table. The last line was 5 words. I am proud of her. I did not act yet. I read everything 3 times. I let it sit. Over the following 2 weeks, before the trust was formally disclosed to the rest of the family in writing, my mother called 4 times. She talked about the house needing repairs before it can even be listed. She talked about Corey's condo association raising fees at the worst possible time. She talked once about how family money should stay in the family, not get locked up in some trust nobody can touch, a sentence she delivered lightly, like weather, like it wasn't aimed at anything. Corey drove 2 states to see me in person on a Saturday in April. Daniel let him in, made himself scarce the way he does when he can read a room before I've said a word. Corey sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel and I eat breakfast every morning, and told me that he'd talked to a lawyer of his own, that trusts like this get challenged all the time, that Dad wasn't in his right mind at the end. A claim contradicted, I already knew, by 4 years of the trust's existence and a will executed with the same clear-eyed competence as every financial decision my father had made in his life. Corey said he would have wanted us to split it evenly. That's just who Dad was. I asked him one question. I asked where he thought I'd been living the summer I was 17. He didn't have an answer. He said something about how that was a long time ago, about how families move past things. I didn't argue with him. I didn't need to. I finished my coffee, walked him to the door, and called my attorney that afternoon. I told her to send the letters formal notice that the trust would be honored exactly as written, and that any challenge would be met with full documentation of its basis, including the notarized letter Mr. Halloran still had on file. The gathering came 3 weeks later. My mother called it a family dinner at the house, the same house, purchased with the same relocation that had once left a note on a counter instead of a daughter. She said it would be good for everyone to talk this through like a family, which was, I noted, the first time in 12 years anyone had used that particular phrase in relation to me. I went. I brought a folder. The dinner started the way these things do. Small talk stretched thin over a roast my mother had clearly spent all day on, an offering disguised as hospitality. Corey's wife asked about my job, too brightly. My mother refilled water glasses that didn't need refilling. Then, over dessert, Corey stood, tapped his glass with a spoon like it was a toast at a wedding, and said that he wanted to say something, that it was time the family settled this the right way, that Dad would have wanted the trust restructured to reflect what's fair. He used the word fair 4 times in 90 seconds. I counted. When he finished, my mother looked at me and said, gently, the way you'd speak to someone you were worried might make a scene, sweetheart. Don't you think it's time to do the right thing? I asked for the floor. My mother nodded, relieved, clearly expecting surrender. I opened the folder. I started with the trust document itself, reading aloud the clause naming me and the reasons stated within it, financial responsibility assumed at 17, without parental support. I watched my mother's face when I read that sentence in my father's own legal language, because it meant he had written down, permanently, in a document she could not later dispute, exactly what she had done. Next I placed a copy of the note. I had photographed it the week I found it, 17 years old and already, apparently, someone who understood that some things need to be preserved exactly as they happened. For sentences. Rent paid through August. You'll figure it out. I read it aloud, once, without commentary, and let it sit on the table between the water glasses. Then I placed the payment plan I'd negotiated with my landlord at 17, a copy I'd kept because I keep everything beside a photograph from Corey's wedding, 3 years before mine, table 11. The seating chart with my name typed in a smaller font than the immediate family's, because I had, by then, become a guest in my own family's understanding of the word. My mother's response moved the way these things do. Soft, at first, that's not fair, we did the best we could. Then emotional, you don't know what those years were like for us either. Then, when I didn't raise my voice, louder, you have no idea what we sacrificed for that job. Then, from Corey, something sharper, something about how I was always the martyr, how I'd always made everything about being the good one. I let each escalation land, and I answered each one a register quieter than the last, until the room had gone nearly silent trying to hear me. Corey's wife, who had said little all evening, put her fork down at one point and said, quietly, to no one in particular, I always thought that story about senior year sounded worse than anyone let on. No one answered her. It wasn't absolution. It was just the first honest sentence spoken at that table in 12 years, and I acknowledged it with a small nod before continuing. Last, I took out my father's letter. I did not read all of it. I read one line, the line that mattered, the line that had kept me up 3 nights in that hotel room. I am proud of her. I set it on top of the note from 12 years earlier, the 2 documents touching, for words and 5 words, the entire distance of my relationship with my parents contained in 9 words written 12 years apart. No one spoke for a long moment. My mother's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. I stood, closed the folder, and said the only thing I said all evening that wasn't a document. I told them that I'd figured it out, that they'd been right about that much, eventually, and that the trust would be honored exactly as my father had written it, because for the first time in this family, someone had finally put in writing what they actually meant. Then I left. The trust was honored in full, without further legal challenge. Corey's attorney reviewed the notarized letter and, according to my own attorney, advised him within a week that there was nothing to contest. The house was sold 8 months later. My mother moved into a smaller condo 2 towns from Corey, and our calls have not resumed. Corey and I have spoken twice since that dinner, both times brief, both times about logistics, neither time about the note. His wife sent me a card, unprompted, the following winter. I keep it in the same box as my graduation program. The note and the letter, I had both framed together in a single frame, and they hang in my home office, not as a trophy, but as a kind of ledger, the debit and the eventual, imperfect credit. My father's letter doesn't erase the note. It exists beside it. That's the only honest way I know how to keep it. With a portion of the trust, I did something my father never got to see and never asked for. I set up a small, quiet fund at the high school I graduated from, not named after me, not announced, administered through the guidance office, available to any senior who needs emergency housing or living costs to finish the year. The counselor who processes the applications doesn't know my name. That's intentional. It isn't a monument. It's simply money going where it was needed, without a note attached telling anyone to figure it out alone. I don't think of any of this as revenge, and I want to be precise about that distinction, because precision is the only inheritance I ever really trusted. Revenge is about making someone pay for what they did. This was never that. This was simply the closing of an account that had been left open, unpaid, and quietly accruing for 12 years, a debt I never agreed to carry, finally reconciled to zero. Calm was never the absence of feeling in me. It was the discipline of not spending feeling on people who'd already shown you the ledger they were keeping. My family had confused the two my entire life. I never did. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.